Well, we've reached the final week of June, which means this is also the final week of the Supreme Court's current session. Now, the court, it released a few decisions this morning, but it didn't rule on the two big ones, the most anticipated cases dealing with adding citizenship questions to the census or on the legality of political gerrymandering. Now, in cases announced today, the justice sided with a clothing designer whose trademark was thought to be offensive. He can now trademark his clothing line name. In another case, the court, it took a pro-business stance, ruling against a newspaper in a Freedom of Information case. The ruling essentially determined that anything intended to be kept secret can be considered confidential and kept from the public. And in a third case, the court rejected a broad definition in a gun case that would have triggered a mandatory minimum sentence. Justice GORSUCH, he joined the four liberals in that decision. But that kind of ideological crossover will probably be the exception, not the norm. That is, we anticipate the court's final rulings of the session. Now, three of the court's four liberal justices, they've already sounded the alarm in the recent weeks about the court reversing precedents, with Justice Stephen Breyer's warning the most dire. Quote, "Today's decision," he wrote in a dissent last month, "can only cause one to wonder which cases the court will overrule next." While many people immediately look to Roe versus Wade after those comments, they could also pop up in both the census citizenship case and the political gerrymandering decision, both of which have the power to impact elections in 2020 and far beyond. Now, for more, we turn to Kelly Percival. Kelly is the counsel for the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. Kelly, thanks for the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Well, before we get into the two looming cases and the precedent, I've seen now Kagan, I saw Ginsburg, and I saw Justice Breyer, as I mentioned there before, all, saying, heads up people here, things that we've taken for granted may not be so set in stone, and precedent, which usually is, accepted from one court to the next, that may be up for grabs. Do you think they have reason to worry here in terms of some of not only the decisions, but some of the opinions the justices have already given in other cases?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. And I agree with you. It's pretty scary stuff when they're talking about going against precedent and not following stare decisis. But in terms of the census case, it really, under the law and the egregious facts of the case, it should be an easy one for the justices. 3 federal courts have already found that there were egregious violations of the Administrative Procedure Act. Everything from the Commerce Department violating a provision of the Census Act to ignoring uncontested evidence in the record that the citizenship question is going to lead to an undercount of, during the trial, the Census Bureau was saying about 6.5 million people would be uncounted as a result of the citizenship question. But a new study that just came out in the last few days is actually putting that number closer to 9 million people, which would put it more people than the state of New Jersey has. It would be the 11th largest state in the country if 9 million people if all those people were in one state to go uncounted. So it's really, it should be an open and shut case for them. There isn't really a precedent for them to overthrow in this case. If they just look at the law and the facts, it should be an easy conclusion for them to say that the Commerce Department violated the law.
To that end, I tried to get to it in the windup to this, but the idea that gerrymandering and obviously these census questions, which would have huge impacts both economically to certain states here by undercounting certain people, obviously electorally, be how many people actually will be represented in districts and states, etc. That all said, we could really be significantly, for at least the next decade, reshaping elections as a consequence for what we could learn in the next 24, 48 hours. I'm not overhyping that, am I?
No, I don't think you are at all. Both of these cases together could have major ramifications for American democracy. The census is, it's the foundation of our democracy. It's the numbers we use to determine how many representatives in the U.S. House each state gets. And in addition to that, it's also how we divvy up about $900 billion worth of federal funding every year And so that has major implications just for how states can run on a daily level. We're talking about funding for things as basic as healthcare, school supplies, and food. It's going to impact American democracy hugely, depending on what they decide. But it's also going to have a huge impact on people's day-to-day lives for the next decade.
So, trying to read the tea leaves a little bit here, both in terms of some of the questions that I know it's very dangerous to try to predict how a court will rule, but in terms of the makeup and in terms of the players, everybody seems to say, oh, Roberts is a wild card here, although I think he's a pretty consistent conservative vote. What is your read of both some of the newer justices and how they're basically voting as blocks?
Well, I think as you mentioned at the beginning of the segment, there were some cases just decided today. One opinion, we had Kagan siding with the conservatives, and we had Justice Gorsuch siding with the liberals. So I don't think that they are just doing things along partisan lines. If for those of us who attended the oral argument, it did seem the conservative justices seemed to have their minds made up, except for John Roberts, who didn't really show his hand at all. He seemed to not really buy arguments that the plaintiffs don't have standing, that is the ability to, or the right to bring a lawsuit against the question. He seemed to pretty much think that this case was one that was legitimately brought, but he didn't really indicate how he's going to rule on the merits of the question itself. But I would say that given the facts of the case, given the new documents that have come to light over the past month, it's going to be very, very hard for the justices to issue an opinion that is defensible and that also upholds the question.
What else are you going to be looking for before the session closes? Obviously, those are the two headliner cases, and obviously you're going to be looking at the supporting and the dissenting reasons as to why, but other cases as well you're keeping an eye on?
Those are the two that affect our program areas here at the Brennan Center. We're really about keeping an eye on American democracy and making sure that things function normally and we have an equal representation in our government.
Interesting. I know for a lot of people, they say how they will rule here, coming back to the first question in this interview, we're going to learn a lot about precedent. Do you feel the same way, that if they upend what basically we've all taken as tenets and how the Commerce Department, most people think, definitely overstepped their bounds, if somehow they don't read it that way, do you think that could have a chilling answer as to what could happen next in the next session and some of the other cases that could be coming down the pike?
Well, if that happens, again, like I said, it would be an indefensible opinion under both the facts and the law of the case. That is just crystal clear. It would be very hard to explain in any terms that didn't make it look like just a partisan decision. But the legal implications for the case would really be under the Administrative Procedure Act, because in order for them to uphold the question, they would have to say everything the Commerce Department did was okay. And normally, under the Administrative Procedure Act, which is the law that governs how federal agencies like the Commerce Department are allowed to make decisions like this, they have to do things like they have to follow the law, basic. They have to make decisions based on reason and the facts and evidence in front of them. Again, none of that happened in this case. So if they were to hold that all of that was okay, it would sort of be gutting those provisions and allowing agencies to operate in a black box, really, in the future and do whatever they want as long as they could provide a reason for it. In this case, the Commerce Department has been claiming that its reason for wanting the question is to better enforce minority voting rights under the Federal Voting Rights Act, and that again, 3 courts have found that that was complete pretext and that is a lie. They couldn't determine what the real reason was, but they did say that that's not a reason. So if the court buys that, they're giving agencies the opportunity in the future to just make up whatever reason they want in order to do what they want for political ends, and they can basically lie to the American public.
Kelly Percival, thank you, and I know you'll be watching, as we will as well, in the next few days here. I appreciate the time.
Thank you.